He thought he'd won. They thought they could erase my father's legacy, make that house theirs. But then the letter arrived, the one my father had prepared years before his death. They didn't know that everything was just beginning. As I stood in the doorway of the home he built with his own hands, watching them celebrate their supposed victory, I felt the weight of the envelope in my pocket. The house still smelled of sawdust and old wood, of memories they were trying to paint over. They had no idea what was coming. My name is Samantha Caldwell, Sam to everyone who knows me, and I'm 35 years old. I work as a senior software engineer at Lincrest Systems here in Port Verde, a coastal city where the salt air mingles with the scent of pine and where my father built our life from nothing. Robert Caldwell wasn't just my father. He was my hero. He started Caldwell Restorations with nothing but a toolbox and determination, eventually becoming the most sought-after contractor for historical preservation in the region. While other kids spent weekends at the mall, I spent mine at job sites, watching him breathe life back into forgotten buildings. He taught me that structures aren't just wood and stone. They're repositories of memory, vessels of human stories. Our house was his masterpiece, not because it was grand or expensive, but because he built it himself, board by board, nail by nail. It's a classic craftsman from 1924 that he restored and expanded over 20 years. Every door frame, every built-in bookshelf, every hand-carved banister told the story of his craftsmanship. The workshop out back was his sanctuary, filled with tools collected over decades, some inherited from his own father, others discovered at estate sales and lovingly restored. Build trust, not walls, he'd tell me as we worked together on his 1967 Mustang in the garage. And hold on to what's worth keeping. We documented everything in notebooks, every repair, every modification, every lesson learned. Those Saturday afternoons, covered in grease and laughing at his terrible jokes, were the foundation of who I became. He taught me to read blueprints before I could properly read novels. By 12, I could identify every type of wood joint. By 16, I was helping him restore Victorian-era crown molding. But more than techniques, he taught me values, integrity, persistence, and the importance of preserving what others would carelessly discard. The workshop smelled of cedar and machine oil, a scent that still makes my chest tighten with memory. His workbench, scarred from thousands of projects, held tools arranged with military precision. Each chisel, each plane, each saw had its place. Respect your tools, he'd say, and they'll never let you down. 3 years ago, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, everything changed. He was reviewing plans for a new restoration project when his heart simply stopped. The doctor said it was quick, painless, a massive heart attack that took him before he even knew what was happening. I got the call at work, and the world tilted off its axis. The funeral was a blur of faces and condolences. Hundreds came. Clients whose homes he'd saved, workers he'd mentored, historians who valued his dedication to preservation. They all had stories about Robert Caldwell's kindness, his skill, his integrity, but when everyone went home, when the casseroles were eaten and the flowers had wilted, I was left with a grief so profound it felt like drowning. The house became both comfort and torment. Every room held him, his coffee mug still on the kitchen counter, his reading glasses on the workshop bench, his handwriting on notes stuck to the refrigerator. Mom and I moved through the space like ghosts, unable to change anything, unable to move forward. I thought losing him was the worst thing that could happen to our family. I thought the sharp edge of grief was the deepest cut I'd endure. But I was naive. I didn't know that some losses come in waves, that some people wait for vulnerability like vultures circle dying things. I didn't know that while I was trying to preserve my father's memory, others were already planning to erase it. Looking back now, I should have seen the signs. But grief makes you blind to danger, and trust makes you vulnerable to betrayal. The house my father built with love was about to become a battlefield, and the war for his legacy was just beginning. Mom started attending a grief support group at the community center 3 months after Dad died. I was relieved. Margaret Caldwell had always been the quieter half of my parents' partnership, and watching her fade into herself after losing Dad was almost as painful as losing him. When she came home from her first meeting with something approaching a smile, I felt hope for the first time in months. "There's someone there who really understands," she told me over dinner one night. "His name is Steve Hargrove. He lost his wife 2 years ago, pancreatic cancer." I was grateful someone could reach her in her grief when I couldn't. My own pain was too raw, too consuming. I nodded, encouraged her to keep going, told her how proud Dad would be that she was trying to heal. Steve's name began appearing in every conversation. Steve said this about processing loss. Steve recommended that book about moving forward. Steve thought the support group should meet twice a week instead of once. At first, I was simply thankful Mom had found a friend who understood her pain. Then Steve started appearing at our house. First, just dropping Mom off after meetings, then staying for coffee, then dinner. His presence felt like an intrusion, but I bit my tongue. Mom deserved companionship, even if the timing felt wrong to me. Steve was in his early 50s, tall and lean with silver hair and a salesman's smile that never quite reached his eyes. He dressed in polo shirts and khakis, drove a newer BMW, and had a way of dominating conversations that made me unconsciously lean away from him. But Mom seemed lighter around him, so I tried to be supportive. 6 months after Dad's death, 6 months, Mom announced that Steve would be moving in. "It's not about replacing your father," she said, avoiding my eyes. "But this house is so big, and Steve's lease is up, and it just makes sense." Makes sense? As if any of this made sense. As if Dad's workshop still smelling of sawdust made sense with another man's car in the driveway. But the real shock came when Steve arrived with his 2 adult children in tow. Jason was 28, unemployed, with the soft look of someone who'd never worked with his hands. Lydia was 25, pregnant, with no mention of the father. They descended on our house like they'd been invited to a resort. "What a great place," Jason said, surveying the living room like he was calculating its value. "Definitely needs updating, though. Those built-ins are so dated." Those built-ins were hand-carved by my father over 3 months. I watched him painstakingly match the original 1920s craftsmanship, staying true to the home's heritage while adding modern functionality. Dated. Lydia complained about the stairs, the bathroom fixtures, the kitchen layout. "When the baby comes, this place will need to be baby-proofed. All these sharp corners and old windows, it's practically a death trap." Steve just smiled his empty smile and said, "Don't worry, Princess. We'll make it perfect for you." Within weeks, things began disappearing. Dad's tools from the workshop. Jason needed them for a project, the vintage furniture Dad had restored. Lydia's setting up a nursery. The boxes of restoration hardware Dad had collected. Steve thought they were junk. Mom seemed oblivious, or worse, complicit. She started wearing different clothes, modern and uncomfortable looking. She removed Dad's photos from the mantel, saying it was time to move forward. She donated his clothes without asking if I wanted anything. Each action felt like a small betrayal, another piece of Dad being erased. "Mom, that's Dad's legacy you're giving away," I said after catching Jason loading Dad's tool chest into his truck. "Oh, Sam," she sighed, and there was something different in her voice, something coached. "Steve says dwelling on the past isn't healthy. We need to embrace our new family dynamic." New family dynamic. The words tasted like ash. This wasn't a family. It was an invasion. And I was starting to realize that Steve Hargrove hadn't stumbled into our lives by accident. He'd targeted Mom in that grief support group, identified her as vulnerable, wealthy by Port Verde standards, and alone. But I still had no idea how far they were willing to go, or how much I was about to lose. The first time I came home to find contractors in the house, I thought there'd been some mistake. 3 men were ripping out the original bathroom tiles, hand-painted arts and crafts pieces Dad had spent months sourcing from salvage yards. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded. Steve emerged from the hallway, clipboard in hand. "Updating this old place. These tiles are a safety hazard. Too slippery when wet." "This is my house. I said, my voice shaking with rage. You have no right. Actually, Steve interrupted, that salesman's smile spreading across his face. I live here now. Your mother and I are making improvements. You should be grateful. We're increasing the property value. I wanted to scream that value wasn't measured in dollars, that those tiles were irreplaceable, that Dad had driven 6 hours to find them at an estate sale in Oregon. Instead, I called Mom at her book club. Steve's just trying to help, she said, her voice distant. The house needs updating. Sam, we can't live in the past forever. Within 3 weeks, the transformation accelerated. Jason converted Dad's workshop into his personal gym, selling the vintage woodworking tools at a fraction of their worth. I found out when I saw Dad's 100-year-old Stanley planes listed on Craigslist for $20 each. By the time I responded to the ads, they were gone. Those were collectibles, I confronted Jason. Some of those tools were from my grandfather. They were just gathering dust, he shrugged, adjusting his new weight bench where Dad's workbench used to stand. Besides, I needed the money for supplements. Lydia was worse. She hired contractors to replace the hand-scraped hardwood floors with cheap vinyl planks. Easier to clean with a baby, she explained, rubbing her growing belly, the original wood floors, which Dad had spent an entire summer restoring on his knees, were torn out and thrown in a dumpster. I tried to salvage some pieces, but they'd been destroyed in the removal. The built-in bookshelves were next. Too dark, Lydia declared. The room needs to be bright and cheerful for the nursery. They were painted white, thick, globby paint that obscured the grain of the quarter-sawn oak Dad had carefully selected and finished. Steve oversaw it all like a general conducting a campaign. New windows replaced the restored originals. The copper gutters Dad had installed were swapped for vinyl. The hand-carved front door, which Dad had spent 2 months restoring, was replaced with a fiberglass model from Home Depot. You're destroying everything, I finally exploded at dinner one night. Steve set down his fork deliberately. We're improving our home. If you don't like it, perhaps you should consider finding your own place. This is my place. Dad left this house to me. Your father left it to the family, Steve said smoothly. And I'm family now. Your mother and I are partners, which means what's hers is mine. And since you're living here rent-free, I'd think you'd show a little more gratitude. I looked at Mom, waiting for her to correct him, to remind him that Dad's will had been specific, but she just stared at her plate, silent. That night, I heard them talking in their bedroom. Steve's voice carried through the walls Dad had insulated himself. She's becoming a problem, Margaret. Maybe it's time she learned that things have changed. Mom's response was too quiet to hear, but Steve's laugh was clear enough. Don't worry about it. I'll handle everything. I always do. The next morning, I woke to find my key didn't work. They'd changed the locks while I was sleeping. I had to ring the doorbell to my own home, and Jason answered, smirking. Steve says you need to call before coming over now, he said. Family privacy and all. I still had my legal ownership documents, but Steve had possession, and as I stood on the porch my father had built, locked out of the home he'd created with his own hands, I realized this wasn't just about property. This was about erasure. They weren't just taking the house. They were systematically destroying every trace of Robert Caldwell. But they'd underestimated 2 things: my father's foresight and my determination to protect his legacy. The war for my father's house had truly begun. Mark Danner's law office occupied the 2nd floor of a restored Victorian downtown, one of the buildings Dad had brought back to life 10 years ago. Mark had been Dad's attorney and friend for 2 decades, handling all the paperwork for Caldwell restorations. When I explained what was happening, his face darkened. Your father was very specific in his will, Mark said, pulling out a thick folder. The house, the workshop, all contents, everything goes to you. Sam, Margaret has lifetime residency rights, but no ownership. She can't sell, modify, or transfer any rights without your explicit written consent. Then how are they getting away with this? Mark sighed. Possession is 9/10 of reality, if not law. You could file for an emergency injunction, Get a restraining order? Force them out? But he hesitated. It's your mother. Judges hate family property disputes. They'll push for mediation first, and that could take months while the destruction continues. So what do you suggest? Try talking to them first. Document everything. If that fails, we'll go nuclear with legal action. But Sam, be prepared. This could get ugly. I attempted diplomacy that evening. Arriving at the house with copies of the will and property deed, Steve answered the door, blocking my entry. We need to discuss the legal situation, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Come in, he said, stepping aside with mock courtesy. Let's have a family meeting. The living room was full, not just Steve, Mom, Jason, and Lydia, but also Aunt Patricia, Mom's sister, 2 cousins, Reverend Mills from Mom's church, and 3 neighbors, an ambush disguised as concern. Sam, Aunt Patricia started, we're all worried about you. This obsession with the house isn't healthy. Obsession? I looked around the room, noting the freshly painted walls where Dad's photographs once hung. This is my legal property being destroyed. Steve stood, commanding the room. Your mother has been through enough. First losing Robert, now dealing with a daughter who values property over family. He turned to the others. She's trying to evict her own mother, and Lydia. He gestured to her dramatically. 8 months pregnant, and Sam wants her on the street. That's not, I started, but Lydia began crying on cue. I just wanted to prepare a nice home for my baby, she sobbed. But nothing we do is good enough. She hates us because we're not her real family. Reverend Mills leaned forward. Sam, the Bible teaches us about forgiveness and generosity. Your father wouldn't want this conflict. My father would want his life's work preserved, I shot back. Your father is gone, Steve said coldly, and the living matter more than monuments to the dead. Mom finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. Sam, please, just let it go. Steve knows what's best for the house. He has experience in real estate. Experience in real estate? I laughed bitterly. He's destroying architectural history. Steve's phone rang, and he answered it with a smile. Yes, she's here now. He listened, then held out the phone. It's your supervisor at Lincrest. Apparently, there's concern about your emotional stability affecting your work performance. My blood ran cold. You called my work? I called as a concerned family member, Steve said smoothly. Mental health is serious. Sam, this fixation on material possessions, the anger issues, the inability to accept change, it's troubling. The room murmured agreement. They'd all been prepped. I realized this wasn't an intervention. It was character assassination. She even tried to break in last night, Jason added. I have video from the security cameras Steve installed. I used my key to my own house. The key you weren't supposed to have anymore, Steve corrected. After we explicitly told you to call first. Aunt Patricia reached for my hand. Honey, maybe you should talk to someone, a therapist. This isn't like you. I pulled away, looking at each face in turn. These people had known me my whole life, had eaten at Dad's table, had benefited from his generosity. Now they sat in his vandalized home, taking the word of a stranger over mine. This isn't over, I said, standing to leave. Actually, Steve said, his smile widening, I think you'll find it is. I've consulted with my own attorney. Given your mother's residency rights and her new marital status, any court will side with the elderly widow over the aggressive daughter trying to make her homeless. As I left, I heard him comforting the others, painting himself as the protector, the reasonable one, the man trying to hold a family together against an ungrateful child's greed. But walking to my car, I remembered something Dad once said. When someone shows you who they are, believe them, and when they declare war on what you love, make sure you have ammunition they don't expect. Steve thought he'd won with public opinion and emotional manipulation. He didn't know that Robert Caldwell had always been 3 steps ahead, even from beyond the grave. 3 days after the ambush, Mark Danner called me to his office. His voice on the phone had been strange, urgent, but oddly excited. Sam, you need to come in immediately. There's something your father left that I wasn't authorized to give you until certain conditions were met. What conditions? Just come. Trust me. I found Mark in his conference room with documents spread across the mahogany table. In the center sat a thick manila envelope, sealed with wax bearing Dad's signature stamp, the one with the Craftsman House logo he'd designed for Caldwell Restorations. Your father gave me this 5 years ago, Mark explained, with very specific instructions. I was only to give it to you if someone tried to take the house from you or destroy his work. He said, and I'm quoting, "If they come for what I built, give Sam the ammunition she needs." My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter in Dad's careful script, along with a stack of legal documents, photographs, and bank records. "My dearest Sam," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then someone is trying to take what we built together. I've watched too many families torn apart by property and greed, seen too many legacies destroyed by those who value money over memory, so I prepared for war, hoping for peace." The letter detailed everything: how he'd transferred the property title to me alone 3 years before his death, filing it with the county but keeping it private; how he'd established a trust that separated the house from any marital assets; how he'd documented every restoration, every improvement, every historical element with the State Historical Preservation Society. But the most stunning revelation was about Steve Hargrove. "If a man named Steve Hargrove is involved," Dad had written, "check the attached documents carefully. I met him 2 years ago at a restoration site. He was trying to convince an elderly client to sell their historic home for demolition. When I intervened, he threatened me, said he'd find a way to get even. I hired a private investigator. Forgive me for not telling you. The results are enclosed." The investigator's report was thorough. Steve Hargrove had a pattern: joining grief support groups, targeting wealthy widows, moving in quickly, and systematically liquidating assets. 3 previous cases in different states. Each time, he'd disappeared once the money ran out, leaving destroyed families and empty bank accounts. "Jesus Christ," Mark whispered, reading over my shoulder. There was more. Dad had recorded several conversations with Steve from 2 years ago. Transferred to CD, Mark played one on his laptop. Steve's voice, threatening and cold. "That old Victorian is worth more as land than as some museum piece. You cost me $100,000 today. Caldwell. I don't forget things like that." Dad's calm response: "Then you'd better remember this too. I protect what matters. Always have, always will." The final document was the killer, a witnessed codicil to the will, signed by 3 attorneys and filed with the state. In the event of any attempt to fraudulently claim, damage, or destroy the property located at 247 Craftsman Lane, Port Verde, all authority transfers immediately and irrevocably to my daughter, Samantha Jane Caldwell. This includes the right to evict any and all occupants, regardless of relation, with immediate effect. Any person named Steve Hargrove, or any associates thereof, are specifically barred from the property in perpetuity. Mark leaned back in his chair. "Your father was a chess player. Sam, he saw this coming. He knew Steve would come after us? Maybe not specifically, but he knew someone might. He told me once that the 2 things that bring out the worst in people are death and property. He wanted you protected from both." I studied the papers, feeling Dad's presence so strongly it took my breath away. Even in death, he was still protecting me, still teaching me. "What do I do now?" Mark smiled, and for the first time in months, it was genuine. "Now we go to war, properly armed. We file for immediate eviction based on the codicil. We present evidence of Steve's fraudulent history. We get a restraining order, and we do it all tomorrow morning before they can react." "What about Mom?" "Your father thought of that too." Mark pulled out one more document. "A psychiatric evaluation clause. If Margaret is deemed to be under undue influence, temporary conservatorship passes to you for her protection. Your dad didn't want her abandoned. Sam, he wanted her saved." I held the letter to my chest, feeling the weight of my father's foresight, his love, his determination to protect what mattered even from beyond the grave. "One more thing," Mark said, handing me a key. "Your dad said if you ever needed to use these documents, you should check the floor safe in the workshop. The combination is your birthday backwards. He said you'd understand what to do with what's inside." Tomorrow, Steve Hargrove would learn that Robert Caldwell was still very much in this fight. And this time, I had all the ammunition I needed. The legal notices were served at 8 a.m. sharp. I watched from across the street as the sheriff handed Steve the papers. His face went from confused to furious in seconds. Within an hour, my phone exploded with calls and texts. But Steve didn't retreat. He escalated. By noon, a reporter from the Port Verde Gazette was knocking on my apartment door. "Ms. Caldwell, care to comment on allegations that you're trying to make your pregnant sister-in-law homeless?" "She's not my sister-in-law," I said carefully. "And no comment." The story ran online within hours. Local software engineer attempts to evict widowed mother and pregnant woman. Steve had given them a tearful interview. Lydia posed with her hand on her belly, and they'd even gotten a quote from Mom about her troubled daughter's possessiveness. The comment section was brutal. People who didn't know me or my family were calling me heartless, greedy, mentally unstable. Someone posted my LinkedIn profile. Another found my work address. Steve's campaign intensified over the next 3 days. He contacted my father's old clients, telling them I was mentally unstable and trying to destroy Dad's legacy. He reached out to the Historical Preservation Society, claiming I was the one who'd authorized the renovations. He even got Reverend Mills to post on the church Facebook page asking for prayers for a family in crisis. "He's trying to poison the jury pool," Mark warned. "If this goes to trial, everyone in Port Verde will have an opinion." The 4th day, things got worse. A prayer vigil was organized outside the house. My house. 40 people with candles, singing hymns, while Steve played the devoted stepfather trying to hold a family together. Local news showed up. Steve gave another interview, this time with his arm around Mom, who looked sedated. "We just want peace," he told the camera, "but Sam seems determined to destroy this family out of grief and anger. We pray she gets the help she needs." Jason started a GoFundMe. "Help us fight unjust eviction." It raised $8,000 in 2 days. The description painted me as an unstable daughter jealous of her mother's happiness, trying to steal an inheritance. Complete lies wrapped in enough truth to seem believable. Former coworkers reached out, concerned. My supervisor at Lincrest called me in for a wellness check. Even the coffee shop where I'd been a regular for 5 years. The barista asked if I was doing okay, considering everything. Steve had weaponized the entire community against me. Then came the restraining order. Steve filed one against me, claiming harassment, stalking, and threats of violence, all fabricated. But it meant I couldn't go within 500 feet of my own house until the hearing. "This is insane," I told Mark. "He's literally stolen my house and convinced everyone I'm the villain." "He's good at this," Mark admitted, reviewing Steve's history. "This is exactly what he did in Arizona and Nevada. Create chaos, destroy reputation, force a settlement." The lowest point came when Aunt Patricia called. "Sam, honey, I know you're hurting, but this has to stop. The whole family is being torn apart." Steve showed us the psychiatric evaluation he had done. "What psychiatric evaluation?" "The one from Dr. Morrison. It says you're showing signs of complicated grief disorder and paranoid delusions. He's just trying to help you." "Sweetie?" I hadn't seen any Dr. Morrison. Steve had fabricated a psychiatric evaluation. The man's audacity was breathtaking. But while Steve was performing for the public, he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd gotten cocky. Jason posted photos on Instagram from inside the house, showing off improvements, including shots of the workshop with the floor safe visible in the background, still unopened. That night, I called Mark. "Can you get those Instagram posts authenticated and submitted as evidence?" "Why?" "Because they just prove they haven't found everything. Dad's final card is still in play." Steve thought public opinion was power. He thought destroying my reputation would force me to surrender, but he didn't understand what Dad had taught me. When someone attacks with noise and chaos, you respond with facts and law, and the facts were about to bury him. The hearing was in 2 days. Steve had his angry mob and his web of lies, but I had something better, proof of who he really was and a father who'd seen this coming from beyond the grave. "Keep pushing, Steve," I whispered, looking at the photo of Dad on my phone. "You're about to learn why Robert Caldwell's daughter doesn't break." The war wasn't over. It was about to reach its crescendo. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and drizzling, fitting weather for what felt like a funeral. But it wasn't a funeral. It was a resurrection. Mark and I arrived at the house at 10 a.m. with Sheriff Deputies Coleman and Martinez, the court order, and a locksmith. As expected, Steve had assembled his army. At least 50 people stood on the lawn. Church members, neighbors he'd convinced, even some of Dad's old clients he'd turned against me. Jason live-streamed on his phone while Lydia sat prominently in a wheelchair she didn't need, one hand on her belly. Steve stood at the front door like a general defending his fortress. "This is harassment," he announced to the crowd, "a daughter trying to destroy her mother's happiness." Mom stood beside him, looking frail and confused. My heart broke seeing her, but I held firm. Dad's letter had been clear. Save her. Even if she couldn't see, she needed saving. "Mr. Hargrove," Sheriff Coleman said firmly, "we have a court order for immediate eviction based on fraudulent occupation and violation of property terms. You have 30 minutes to gather personal belongings." "This is illegal," Steve shouted. "I have a restraining order against her." "Which was dismissed this morning," Mark interjected. When we presented evidence of fraud to Judge Patterson, Steve's face went white. The crowd murmured uncertainly. I stepped forward, Dad's letter in my hand. My voice carried clear across the yard. "My father, Robert Caldwell, wrote this letter 5 years ago. Would you like me to read it?" "Don't listen to her," Steve said quickly. "She's delusional." But I was already reading, my voice steady and loud. "If you're hearing this, it means someone is trying to steal what I built and destroy what I loved. I want my friends and neighbors to know the truth. The house at 247 Craftsman Lane belongs solely to my daughter, Samantha. I transferred the deed to her 3 years before my death. Anyone claiming otherwise is lying." The crowd grew quiet. Some people began recording on their phones, but not in support of Steve this time. "That's fabricated," Steve protested. "Is this fabricated too?" Mark held up his laptop, playing the audio recording of Steve threatening Dad 2 years ago. Steve's voice, cruel and clear, echoed across the yard. "I don't forget things like that. You cost me $100,000 today. Caldwell?" Reverend Mills stepped back from Steve, his face shocked. Others followed. "Or these?" I held up the investigators' reports. 3 other widows in 3 other states. Same pattern. Join grief support. Marry quickly. Liquidate assets. Disappear. "You're lying," but Steve's voice cracked. Jason stopped live streaming. Lydia stood up from her wheelchair, apparently miraculously healed. "Mrs. Margaret Caldwell," Sheriff Coleman addressed my mother formally. "Are you aware your husband has been previously investigated for elder financial abuse in Arizona and Nevada?" Mom blinked, as if waking from a dream. "What?" Steve grabbed her arm. "Don't listen to them, Margaret. They're trying to confuse you." But Mom was looking at him differently now, seeing him perhaps for the first time. "The investigations, are they real?" "Ma'am," Deputy Martinez said gently, "we verified the reports this morning. There are 3 separate cases." The crowd was dissolving, people backing away from Steve as if he were contagious. Someone muttered, "We've been played," another said. "Poor Sam." Steve made one last desperate play. "Even if that's true, we're married. Margaret has rights. This is her home." "Actually," Mark said, pulling out the final document, "according to California law, marriages entered into under fraudulent pretenses can be annulled. And given your documented history of targeting widows, Mrs. Caldwell has grounds for immediate annulment with prejudice." That's when Steve snapped. He lunged toward me, but the deputies were ready. Within seconds, he was in handcuffs, screaming about lawsuits and revenge while Jason and Lydia scrambled to pack their things. But I wasn't watching them anymore. I was walking toward Mom, who stood frozen on the porch, tears streaming down her face. "Mom?" "Oh, Sam," she whispered. "What have I done? Your father's house. Everything he built. I let them destroy it." "We'll fix it," I said, pulling her into my arms. "We'll restore it all. Dad taught me how." As the deputies led Steve away and the crowd dispersed in embarrassed silence, I stood in the doorway of my father's house. It was damaged but not destroyed, wounded but not dead. Aunt Patricia approached, shamefaced. "Sam, I'm so sorry. We should have trusted you." I just nodded, too exhausted for anger. They'd all learned to live with their choice to side with a stranger over family. The house was finally silent, finally ours again. I walked through the rooms, cataloging the damage, already planning the restoration. In the workshop, I knelt by the floor safe Jason had never found, spinning the combination, my birthday backwards, just as Dad had said. Inside was $50,000 in cash and a note. "For the restoration, when it's needed, build it back better. Sam, love, Dad." Even in death, Robert Caldwell had won. The house stood quiet in the afternoon light as I walked through each room, finally alone. The damage was extensive but not irreversible, like poorly healed wounds that needed to be reopened and properly treated. Steve's cheap vinyl flooring would come up. The painted-over oak shelves could be stripped and restored. The workshop, though emptied of Dad's tools, still had good bones. Mom sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. The last 3 hours had aged her 10 years, but there was clarity in her eyes I hadn't seen since before Dad died. "I remember now," she said quietly. "Steve suggested I increase my sleeping medication, said it would help with the grief, but it made everything foggy, like living underwater." "It's not your fault, Mom." "Isn't it?" She looked around the kitchen, at the cheap cabinet hardware Steve had installed over Dad's handcrafted originals. "I let them in. I let them destroy everything Robert loved." "Dad loved you more than any house," I said, sitting beside her. "And he prepared for this. He knew you might be vulnerable, and he made sure we'd be protected." Over the next 6 months, the restoration began. With Dad's hidden funds and an insurance claim for the vandalism damage, I hired the best craftsmen in Port Verde, many who'd worked with Dad. Word had spread about what really happened, and contractors gave us preferred rates, wanting to be part of bringing Robert Caldwell's house back to life. The floors were the first priority. Under the cheap vinyl, the original hardwood was damaged but salvageable. We spent weeks sanding, repairing, and refinishing until they gleamed like honey in the sunlight, just as Dad had left them. The workshop became my sanctuary. I tracked down many of Dad's tools through online sales records, buying them back at 10 times what Jason had sold them for. Each recovered plane, each rescued chisel felt like recovering a piece of Dad's soul. The workbench, which Jason had left scarred with weight plate drops, was lovingly restored. Steve was charged with fraud, elder abuse, and attempted assault. He took a plea deal, 5 years, with restitution to his previous victims. Jason and Lydia disappeared back to wherever they'd come from. Though Lydia sent one email asking if we'd forward her mail, I didn't respond. Mom slowly came back to herself. She reduced her medications under proper medical supervision and started grief counseling with a legitimate therapist. She helped with the restoration, sharing memories of Dad choosing each fixture, each tile, each piece of wood. It became our healing process, rebuilding not just the house but our relationship. The hardest part was the community. Some people apologized. Reverend Mills came personally, shamefaced and sincere. Others simply pretended nothing had happened. Aunt Patricia tried to explain she'd only wanted what was best for everyone, but our relationship never fully recovered. Trust, once broken, doesn't restore as easily as hardwood floors. But there were unexpected gifts, too. Dad's old clients rallied, donating period-appropriate fixtures and materials. The Historical Preservation Society officially registered the house, protecting it from future damage. The Port Verde Gazette ran a follow-up story about the restoration, finally telling the truth about what had happened. 1 year later, almost to the day of Steve's eviction, we held an open house. The home was perfect, not frozen in time, but alive with Dad's spirit. Every room showed his craftsmanship, his attention to detail, his love for preservation. The workshop had become a small museum of his tools and projects, with photos showing his restoration work throughout Port Verde. As guests walked through, admiring the coffered ceilings and built-in cabinets, I heard over and over, "Robert would be so proud." Mom stood beside me on the front porch as the sun set, painting the restored craftsman details in gold. "He knew, didn't he?" she said. "He knew something like this might happen." "He knew people," I replied, "and he knew that what's worth preserving will survive, if someone's willing to fight for it." That night, after everyone left, I sat in Dad's workshop with his journal, the one where we documented every repair to the Mustang. On the last page, in his careful handwriting, I found one final note I'd never seen before. "Sam, if you're reading this in the workshop after a battle, then you won. I never doubted you would. The house isn't my legacy. Sweetheart, you are. The house is just wood and stone. But you're the one who understands why they matter. Build something beautiful. Guard what's irreplaceable. And remember, I'm proud of you. Always. Dad." I closed the journal and looked around the workshop. Whole again, filled with tools that would create and restore for another generation. Outside, Mom was planting flowers in the garden, humming something I recognized as Dad's favorite song. We'd won, not because we'd kept the house, but because we'd kept faith with what it represented. Craft, dedication, love, and the courage to fight for what matters. The letter had arrived, the control had been established, and Robert Caldwell's true legacy, the strength he'd built in his daughter, had proven unbreakable. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts about Sam's journey. What would you have done in her situation?